Hello, my name is Bill Boswell, WI0JK. Today, we're going to talk about World War II in the Pacific and the key role that radio communications played in the surrender of Japan. The patches you see here from left to right are the Army Airways Communication System, the Far East Air Force Command of the U.S. Army Air Force, and the U.S. Army Air Force insignia. The photo on the right is of my father, also named Bill, William R. Boswell. This is his story. This is probably one of the most famous photos in history. The Japanese surrendered on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. We all know how this story ends, but not many people know how that came about, and even fewer know that the official history was occasionally incomplete. After this presentation, you will be one of the few. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and immediately followed with attacks against U.S. and British bases in the Philippines, Guam, Midway Island, Wake Island, Malaya, and Hong Kong. Within a short time, the Japanese were masters of the Pacific. Fighting the war in the Pacific was very different from the war in Europe. You couldn't march armies or drive tanks from one island to another. The logistical challenges of attack and retreat were incredible. Fighting back took some time. Some of these engagements are infamous. Others have faded with time. All were hard. I found these charts from Pew Research while researching this story. The chart on the left shows the percentage of the total U.S. population in the armed forces from 1900 to 2010. The chart on the right shows the number of Americans who served on active duty in each era. During the World War II era, over 16 million people served. This presentation is about one of those 16 million individual stories. This story is about my dad, a small town boy from a town called Jersey Shore in the central mountains of Pennsylvania, a railroad town. Growing up during the Depression, his father worked in the shops of the New York Central Railroad, and his mother ran a beloved neighborhood corner grocery store that lasted into the 1980s. He graduated from high school in 1938 into a 19% unemployment rate recession. He tried to enlist in the Army that year and was turned down due to his eyesight. He was drafted in 1942 and again told at the physical that his eyesight was too bad. Dejected, he got a last-minute reprieve that day when the draft board needed 2 more volunteers to make quota. He jumped at the opportunity to serve. Before going overseas, he married his high school sweetheart, Lois, and later had my sister and I. After the war, he ran a Dairy Queen and Brown's Barbecue in our hometown of Avis, Pennsylvania, until his retirement. After basic training in Florida, he found himself headed to Scott Field, now Scott Air Force Base, in Belleville, Illinois, about 25 miles east of St. Louis. During World War II, Scott Field's main mission was to train radio operators and mechanics. By June 1945, Scott Field had trained 77,370 technicians who went on to be responsible for vital command and control communication throughout the Army Air Force. In the left image, you can see the Scott Field sign, "Through these gates pass the best damned radio operators in the world." The right image is a cutaway simulator of the radio position in a bomber during training. These images show the immense scale of the training. At every one of these operator positions, you can see the typewriter and a straight key. Every operator had to learn Morse code. To get a better idea of what my dad and the 77,000 other operators had to learn, I found the World War II Military Occupational Specialty description for an Army Airways Communication Service radio operator. If we take a look at some of the highlights, you can see operates radio transmitting and receiving equipment, conducting point-to-point and ground-air operations. Receives CW at a minimum speed of 25-letter random code groups per minute without error. Transmits CW at a minimum speed of 25-letter random code groups per minute without error. Handling message traffic in a network was important. They had to handle, without error, a minimum of 18 plain dress, normal form messages, averaging 10 5-letter random code groups of the tests per hour in a radio network, under actual operating conditions. They had to be able to tune radio receivers to predetermined frequencies. They had to be thoroughly familiar with the functions and operations of all controls on standard communications receivers, intercept signal broadcasts, be able to read and transmit messages by light signals at a minimum speed of 8 words per minute, and have a working knowledge of the operation and adjustment of semi-automatic telegraph keys, and possess a thorough working knowledge of combined radio telephone and radio telegraph procedures and authentication. Well, he made it. Dad completed his radio operator training at Scott and graduated on December 12, 1942, 1 year after the attack on Pearl Harbor. His first duty station was Hensley Field in Fort Worth, Texas, where he was a radio and control tower operator. From there, he was off to New Guinea in October of 1944, and then to the Philippines in February of 1945, and then finally back home in January of 1946. Here's another view of the South Pacific. The island of Numfor in New Guinea is in the smaller red circle on the right, about 9,000 miles from Jersey Shore, Pennsylvania. Thinking back to the previous map slide with the list of engagements, Numfor was the 32nd engagement in July of 1944. My dad arrived there in October. The larger red circle near the middle of the slide is Palawan Island in the Philippines. Palawan is south of the main island of Luzon and the capital of Manila. Some of you may have heard of Palawan, as it was the site of a horrible massacre of U.S. prisoners of war. On December 14, 1944, Japanese soldiers massacred 139 of 150 American POWs. One of the 11 survivors was U.S. Marine Corps Private First Class Glenn McDowell from Urbandale, Iowa. He was one of the 11 prisoners of war who escaped when the Japanese herded them into trenches, dumped gasoline on them, and set them on fire. He was later a key witness in the war crime trials of 1945. After the war, he worked in the Iowa State Patrol and the Polk County Sheriff's Office. My dad never talked much about the war, but he wrote about his experiences. He was also a bit of a pack rat and saved a number of important documents to him. This is a copy of the orders for him to support the Palawan Task Force to retake the island. Note the date, February 9, 1945. 4 days later, he would be on an LST for 14 days, headed for a landing at Puerto Princesa, Palawan. These are my dad's pictures and an excerpt from his memoir. That's him facing the camera in the top picture. Conditions on the flat-bottom LST were rough. The accompanying destroyers were chasing Japanese submarines and the chow was lousy. Today, many associate D-Day with the invasion of Normandy. D-Day is a term that is actually day one of an invasion. Imagine what the day before an invasion was like. For any soldier, in my dad's words, according to the battle plan, our AACS outfit was to go ashore with the emergency radio equipment and secure a position near the beach 15 minutes after the first wave of troops landed. Then we were to try and become operational as quickly as possible. The airstrip, which was about a mile away, was scheduled for capture about the third day. It goes on to say, the talk followed the usual pattern of jokes, reminiscences, tall tales, etc., but I can't remember any of it. Other more serious thoughts were on my mind. It's a hard thing to try and describe my feelings, for I knew very well that these might be my last few hours on Earth. This picture is from Wikipedia. You can see the landing point at Puerto Princesa with the LSTs lined up in the background. The prisoner of war camp can be seen in the picture as well. Imagine this kind of landing point being defended by the 2,000 plus Japanese soldiers on the island. This is just 1 week after Iwo Jima. What would Palawan have in store? Can you imagine what it was like waiting on one of those LSTs for the battle to begin and your turn to charge into the fight? Here's what it was like in my dad's words. Before dawn, our engines were reduced to idling speed, and our destroyers opened up with blasts at the shore. The shell flashes lit up the huge black mass of land lying very close to us. Our air support materialized right on schedule, and we could now discern the remains of the town itself. There was no answering fire from the island, and promptly at 5 o'clock, the first wave of ships rammed onto the flat beach and disgorged their troops. It immediately became apparent that there was no opposition. Within a matter of minutes, we too were on the beach, and in about another 10 minutes, all of our vehicles were driven off and parked in an open area. 3 or 4 guys had been assigned to the transmitters and receivers, and before the last of the trucks had been parked, we were in radio contact with Leyte and Manila. These are original pictures taken by my dad on that first day. The Army had learned ahead of time of the Palawan massacre and was ready to treat that area with respect. My dad's picture of the trench where the POWs' bodies were found is in the center of this slide, and you can see it was right outside the front gates of the prisoner of war camp. These are more original pictures from my dad, including pictures from the Japanese airfield that wasn't anticipated to be captured until the third day. Luckily for my dad and many others, the Japanese had decided to fight it out in the jungles rather than on the beaches. The islanders were relieved and friendly to the U.S. soldiers, but not so much the Japanese occupiers. My dad and some of his radio compatriots had decided to go on a little bit of a tourist expedition in a Jeep and got too close to the front lines, and they ran into some of the native islanders who were taking out revenge on some of the Japanese occupiers that had been captured. In the bottom picture, you'll see my dad standing outside the remains of a building previously occupied by the Japanese. This will come into our story next. Here, we've zoomed in on the picture, and you can see the folded up Japanese aircraft spotting poster in my dad's hand. On the right, you can see my photo of the unfolded poster that we still have today. Looking at that poster, what do you notice? The insignia shows it's a U.S. aircraft. Anything else? Look closer at the engines. It's a pusher. As a radio and control tower operator, my dad was familiar with all the U.S. aircraft, and of course he couldn't read Japanese. For the rest of his life, he always said this was just a propaganda piece because there are no airplanes like that that the U.S. was using. But today we have the internet and AI. I used Google Translate and Google Lens on the image and quickly found out that it was a Bell FM-1 Airacuda. Finding out details from there was easy. A total of 13 aircraft were completed, which equipped a single squadron between 1938 and 1940. But despite constant modifications, performance and reliability were never adequate for combat service. The surviving aircraft were used for ground crew training before being scrapped in 1942. It's interesting to think about how information about that aircraft found its way to the island of Palawan. The U.S. airfield on Palawan quickly became operational for seaplanes used for search and rescue, transports, fighters, and bombers. One interesting small world side note, when I first gave this presentation for our Story County Amateur Radio Club, we discovered that Ron Nelson, KN0R, father was piloting reconnaissance aircraft from Palawan at the same time my father was there. I wonder if they ever met. The call sign for the Army Airways Communication System station on Palawan was WUQF. In the top picture, you can see the original operations building for the airfield, and just to the right, you can see part of the new AACS building. The middle picture is my dad's photo of the new WUQF Quonset hut. The bottom picture is their new living quarters after a bit of wheeling and dealing with the Seabees. As you can see from this excerpt from his memoirs, Conversations with CBs working on the radio station tipped us off to the fact that they were long on Quonset huts and that sort of thing, but were getting very short on beer rations. The result was that we acquired a big Quonset hut with a concrete floor for use as a rec room and a mess hall in our new area, and also a dandy shower complete with concrete floor. These conveniences were erected for us in exchange for 80 cans of beer, 20 for each of the 4 hustlers involved in the deal. Life settled into a routine on Palawan as the island hopping war moved on, and Palawan became an operational base in its support, although still coming under Japanese attack. These are more of my dad's pictures of daily life on Palawan. The top left picture is their tent. Below that, posing in front of a B-24. And on the right, you can see a view of the native fishing village, and below that, some of his friends posing with some of the villagers that they befriended and traded with. And in the center, you can see him on the beach with their pet monkey. The story of how they caught their pet monkey is really pretty interesting. The villagers showed them how to catch them using a coconut. You'd hollow out the coconut, put in kernels of corn, and then attach a rope or a chain to the coconut to keep it in place. The monkey would reach in, get a handful of that corn, and not be able to pull his hand out because his fist was bigger than the hole in the opening of the corn. And the monkeys would not let loose for anything. So basically you could then walk up, catch the monkey, feed it, and have a friend. There was no privacy in these living conditions. This photo was tucked in between the pages of my dad's photo album with the comment, "Business as usual," on the back. These guys aren't sitting on a park bench reading books. These guys are sitting on the latrine. They also saw some horrible things, including the severed head of a Japanese soldier offered in trade, and they had to defend themselves. My dad and 2 other friends were on guard duty one night and fired together into the darkness at what turned out to be an armed Japanese soldier who was trying to sneak into the camp. One of the hits was fatal. No one knows which person fired it. But after the MPs came and registered the body, they were left to bury him themselves. Can you imagine how you would cope with that as a 20-something young man? Life did settle into a routine, but that would soon change with one message. That changed on August 16th, 1945, when a message was copied in the clear, not coded. Keep in mind that this was just 1 week after the second atomic bomb was dropped. I'll pick it up in my dad's words. One of the operators, monitoring one of our standby frequencies, copied a message in plain language. This alone was enough to set the station buzzing, for everything had to be encoded. The message itself was the payoff, though, for it was between the Supreme Allied Commander and the Japanese Imperial Headquarters. We guarded that frequency religiously from then on, and the messages passed back and forth. Before the news was officially announced, we all knew that negotiations for surrender were being discussed and arranged, and our morale got a big boost. The full story of how the Japanese and USA reestablished communications, frequencies, times, etc. after years at war is quite interesting. But our story today starts with the negotiations to actually arrange the negotiations. Here is an original copy of that first message in the string we'll talk about that my dad brought home with him. Language barriers, distrust, confusion, anger, logistics all come into play in this series of communications between Japan and General MacArthur in Manila on the nearby island of Luzon. Just to highlight a couple of things in this first message, it was basically to clarify what the representative that MacArthur, as the Supreme Allied Commander, dictated for the representative of Japan to negotiate with for the negotiations. And so the Japanese didn't quite understand that at first. There was some clarification that requested from MacArthur of what the role was it the person that would be empowered to negotiate the arrangements or to actually sign a surrender. And of course, we know that the surrender itself happened later after this on the battleship Missouri, as we saw earlier. So messages fly back and forth. The Japanese are also asking for help with getting the Soviets to stand down so that they can focus on the actual surrender negotiations as well. And you can imagine the environment was tense as these messages are going back and forth. Before looking at the next messages in the series, we need to step back 3 years to what happened after the Japanese conquered the Philippines and took the island of Luzon. MacArthur was humiliated and ordered to evacuate himself to safety while his soldiers fought on. This defeat and subsequent brutality was very personal for him. The Bataan Death March was one of the most brutal episodes. 3 months after the start of the Battle of Bataan, the Bataan Death March began, forcing 60,000 to 80,000 Filipino and American prisoners of war to march through the Philippines. The route was about 65 miles long. The Bataan Death March is remembered as an absolute tragedy. The prisoners of war were forced to march through tropical conditions during heat, humidity, and rain without adequate medical care. They suffered from starvation and having to sleep in the harsh conditions of the Philippines. The prisoners, unable to make it through the march, were beaten, killed, and sometimes beheaded. The next series of messages, as intercepted and copied at Palawan, are the ones that we're going to really focus in on. These are essentially the messages that were clarifying the details of how the two sides would get together to actually negotiate the surrender and execute it. This was really interesting. We'll zoom in later on one particular part of the message relating to the planes that were carrying the Japanese delegation to the negotiations with MacArthur that I think you'll really find interesting. But the beginning of it is really getting into the nuts and bolts. This message you see on the left is from the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers to the Japanese Emperor, the Japanese Imperial Headquarters. The Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers directs the Japanese Imperial Government to send to his headquarters at Manila, Philippine Islands, a competent representative in the name of the Emperor of Japan with certain requirements for carrying into effect the terms of surrender. The representative will represent the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, documents authorized by the Emperor of Japan, empowering him to receive the requirements of the Supreme Allied Commander. The representative will be accompanied by competent advisors of the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Air Force. The latter advisor will be thoroughly familiar with the air facilities in the Tokyo area. Procedure to transport of the above party for safe conduct is prescribed as follows. Party will travel in a Japanese airplane to an airdrome on the island of Ishima, from which point they will be transported to Manila, Philippine Islands, in a United States airplane. They will be returned to Japan in the same manner. Party will employ an unarmed airplane Type 022 L2, D3 PD. Such airplane will be painted all white and will be marked upon the sides of the fuselage and the top and the bottom of each wing with green crosses. The airplane will be capable of in-flight communications in English on a frequency of 6990 kilocycles. Airplane will proceed to an airfield on the island of Ishima, identified by 2 white crosses prominently displayed in the center of the runway. The exact date and hour of this airplane will depart from Sati Misaki on the southern tip of Kyushu. The route and altitude of the flight and estimated time of arrival at Ishima will be broadcast in English 6 hours in advance from Tokyo on a frequency of 16124 kilocycles. Acknowledgement by radio from this headquarters. And then, in particular, in communications regarding this flight, the code designation will be, quote, Bataan. Repeat, Bataan, unquote, and will be employed. Aircraft will approach Ishima on the course of 180 degrees and circle landing field at 1,800 feet or below cloud level until joined by an escort of United States Army P-38s, which will lead it to a landing. Such escort may join the plane prior to its arrival. Signed, MacArthur. The Japanese response to the message was relatively straightforward, played back all the details pretty much the way that MacArthur detailed them, with the exception of the area that I have highlighted here, where they said that for communication, contact our planes, our call signs will be JBACY and JBACZ. They needed 2 planes instead of just one. Remember that MacArthur had directed them to use the call sign baton, and will operate on the frequencies you have designated. Please notify us at once of the station designation and the frequency of your station in Ishima. The Army's official history that was written after World War II characterizes these messages in plain, easy to understand English. It follows really quite well with the detail of the messages that were copied that went back and forth, with the exception of the area that I have highlighted here. You can see that the message that we just looked at, it was the Japanese back to the Supreme Allied Commander about the aircraft, follows the detailed one pretty well. Communication, contact of our planes, call signs JBACY and JBACZ as you designated. We desire to contact your aerodrome by radio with a frequency of 8915 kilocycles, besides carrying on in-flight voice communication with a frequency of 6970 kilocycles. And then the next thing we're going to take a look at is the reply that MacArthur sent back to the Japanese with regard to the details of this flight. As you can see from the official history, you can see that MacArthur is reported to have very politely said, desire your 2 airplanes to use the call signs Baton 1 and Baton 2 as designated in my radio of the 15th of August. But as you can see from the original messages that we have copies of, the response from MacArthur was not nearly as polite. And as my dad said in his memoirs, MacArthur was burning up the airways as soon as the message that we just took a look at was received in Manila. And here you can see the response from the Supreme Allied Commander to the Japanese Imperial GHQ. In regard to the acceptance of our instructions for the safe conduct of the representative of the Imperial Japanese government and accompanying party, call signs, quote, JBACY and JBACZ, unquote, will not be recognized. The only code word our operators will be instructed to recognize will be, quote, baton, unquote. In the event that 2 airplanes are necessary to convey the party, the call signs will be, quote, baton 1 and baton 2, unquote. Use of any other call signs than these may endanger the safe conduct of your party. Special radio guard will be maintained by our radio station in Ishima with the call letters, quote, WXLZ, unquote, and frequency designated for communication is 6990 kilocycles. Emergency guard will also be maintained by all radio stations in the area on 4595 kilocycles. Caution is again advised in the use of the proper call sign. Signed, MacArthur. End. The last page of the messages, as copied at Palawan, that I have from my father is really pretty interesting. You can see in the first message from 17th of August that deconflicting between countries that have been in war for so long is difficult. This one, the first message in the string from 17th of August, from Japanese General Headquarters to the Supreme Allied Commander. 17 August, at about noon, August 16th, a group of some 12 Allied transports approached extremely near the coast of Kochi, Shikoku. At that time, the Imperial order to cease hostilities had not yet been issued, and our air units ventured to attack the Allied vessels, causing some damage. At 4 p.m., the order was issued to cease hostilities as stated in radiogram number 1. It takes some time for the said order to reach its full effect, so it's earnestly requested that Allied forces will refrain from approaching the home waters of Japan proper until the order will have been fully in effect. Official. End. And then the middle message on this page that was intercepted at Palawan on the 19th of August is really the one that we're interested in here today. It was the rush message, very urgent, from Japanese GHQ to the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. Radiogram number 10, August 19th. The planes carrying the party of representatives had left Kiyosaro's aerodrome at Satimasaki at 0718. Repeat 0718, August 19, repeat 19, and will proceed en route as described in your previous radiogram. Very urgent, rush, and as you can see, they did not question the call signs of Baton 1 and Baton 2 again. The Japanese delegation flew in 2 properly painted white planes with green crosses using MacArthur's designated call signs. Landed on Ishima and were transferred to the U.S. plane to travel on to Manila to meet MacArthur. This change of planes was done to ensure that the delegates were actually on the Japanese planes and to alleviate a concern of a kamikaze attack on MacArthur. The 2 Japanese planes and their air crews remained on Ishima to shuttle the delegates back to Japan after the negotiations. They were reportedly quite friendly and well fed by the Americans, and everybody was happy that the war was ending. As you can see from the picture on the right, just like my dad and the other AACS radio operators on Palawan, it was hard not to celebrate a little. Not everything went smoothly. While the Japanese planes were being pushed back out to the runway for their return trip, one of them ended up in a ditch. Everyone worked together to save the day. Now we've come full circle, back to the beginning of the presentation. The Japanese signed the Articles of Surrender on board the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September, 1945. While we all knew how the story ended, now you know some personal stories and colorful details of how radio communications played a key role in the surrender of Japan. So how did my dad's World War II story end? Well, the Articles of Surrender were signed in September 1945. My dad was ordered home from the Philippines on the 28th of November 1945. But that wasn't such an easy trip either. They departed Manila on the 11th of December 1945 on the Sherman O. Houghton. Arrived in San Francisco on 9 January 1946. He was separated out on the 17th of January 1946 at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. Took a train to Chicago, followed by a 2-day drive back to Pennsylvania. And last quote from his memoirs, this is his actual picture, by the way. On the left, it says, "Through these portals return the best damn soldiers in the world." At about 1 a.m., the lights of the Golden Gate Bridge came in sight, and an hour later, we passed under them. One of the greatest moments of my life. No words to express a feeling like that. I was home. W.R. Boswell. So, what about Palawan today? It's one of the dream vacation places for people, especially scuba divers, to visit. It's been voted as one of the world's best islands for tourism. The Quonset huts have been replaced by luxury resorts. It's truly a tropical paradise. Beautiful waters. You may have seen that the Philippines and the U.S. are again cooperating on defense. And as you can see from a recent article in the graphic on the left, that Palawan is in a strategic location on the South China Sea. And let's hope that history doesn't somehow repeat itself and we end up in hostile situations again in that part of the world. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed the presentation.